Yeah, lovely to see so many people here. Thanks so much for coming. It's actually, for me, it's a real privilege to be able to go to another city and be able to talk about my work and the issues it involves, partly because I learned so much from everybody else. So that's my little bit of encouragement to say, do contribute when we have questions and discussion afterwards, obviously keep your responses relatively short, but if you just want to contribute rather than ask a question, like I'm all ears, I think that would be really useful. Can everybody hear me all right here? Grand. So I'll talk now for like 30, 40 minutes perhaps. But I just wanted to start off by asking you to cast your minds back, those of you like me who are old enough, to 15 years ago. So in the 2010 United Kingdom general election, there was one party standing candidates for Parliament that offered the following policies in its manifesto. Warning that, quote unquote, indigenous British people are set to become a minority within 50 years. It promised to halt all further immigration, increase voluntary repatriation of immigrants, to end what it called the asylum swindle, to deport all foreigners convicted of crimes in Britain regardless of their immigration status, to repeal the Race Relations Act and all other quote-unquote far-left social engineering projects, including local government's diversity and equality policies, to regain sovereign control of the UK's borders by increasing funding for immigration enforcement, to confront the quote-unquote Islamic colonisation of Britain and halt all immigration from Muslim countries, to ban foreigners from receiving benefits, divert the foreign aid budget to funding the NHS, and to cut spending to tackle climate change. So that party that offered these policies in 2010 was the British National Party, who, for those of you not familiar with that, were a political party founded and run by committed neo-Nazis. Their leader in 2010 was a veteran far-right political activist called Nick Griffin, who, for my book on the subject, I've had the experience of meeting and interviewing several times, and I can tell you he's somebody who is still driven by profoundly anti-Semitic conspiracy theory and racism. 2010 was the peak of success for that party, which was never that much success. And even at the peak of their success, when they had a few dozen elected politicians in local government in England and were standing candidates for the general election in 2010, they were more or less regarded as a marginal, extreme, if alarming, sideshow to British politics. But thinking about that list of policies that I read out, how many of those can you recall British politicians espousing or enacting, or politicians in other countries like the US enacting in the last few years? I think it's pretty much all of them. And so 2010 was more or less when I started out reporting on the far right in Britain. So I started writing about the BNP actually the year before, in 2009. And I think one of the things that's given me a perspective on is how over 15 years the far right in the UK have gone from the margins to the mainstream. So in some cases that's actual far right political activists, but I think just as importantly, ideas that were once associated with the far right and regarded as extreme and marginal, that we now see in we see them very, very widespread and widely used in UK national political discourse. And in my talk today, I just thought I'd share a few thoughts with you based on the years I've spent writing and thinking about this, about how we got to this point. So before I go further into that, I should say that I'm almost entirely going to be talking about Westminster politics and the national UK political landscape, which inevitably means, and particularly with this issue, that actually what I'm talking about is English politics. And that's, for a couple of reasons. Obviously, English politics has an outsized influence on the UK's national politics, but it's also, I think, because the traditional political elites in the UK the people that have run governments for the past century or more have been trained and conditioned to think of Britishness and Englishness as interchangeable. And it's partly their inability to move on for that I think has left space for this very strong surge in far-right politics that presents itself kind of at the same time as both English and British. So obviously, that's got a kind of indirect relationship to Northern Ireland, but obviously and more so than ever, it affects how the British state behaves towards all of its citizens and all the people that live within UK territory. But I'm sure the things that I talk about will have resonances with politics here that lots of you will know more about than me, so I think perhaps that's something we can bring out in the discussion a bit later as well. But to answer that question of kind of how we got here, from 15 or so years ago to today, I thought the best way that I can explain it, and this is me trying to maybe be a bit more polemical than I often am in my journalism, is that I think there are three groups of people in the British political classes who are responsible for this. And I'll talk about each group in turn. And I've given each of them a little name of my own design. The first group I have called the true believers. So that would be people on the far right of politics in the UK. Before I talk about them specifically, I thought I'd just explain briefly what I mean by far right, because that's it's a very contested term. It's one of those political labels that nobody would ever voluntarily apply to themselves. I mean, in all my years of writing about the far right, I don't think I've ever had a politician or an activist say, I'm a far right activist. I mean, the nearest I could think to it is that the BNP used to have this slogan that they would use in their campaigning, we're not far right, but we're not far wrong, which is about as witty as they got, really. But it is a useful term, but I think people misunderstand it very often. I think for a lot of people it means it's synonymous with fascist. I would say that fascism is a political current on the far right. It's part of a wider collection of extreme and hardline right-wing nationalist movements, but it's not the only thing going on there. And the most useful little taxonomy for far right that I've come across comes from a political scientist called Cas Mudde, who I believe is doing a talk later on in this series, so he will have much more to say about this, I'm sure. But the way he defines far right is as a kind of umbrella term covering this range of hardline nationalist right-wing movements, but he splits that into two different parts. One part he calls the extreme right, so that would be parties, groups, movements that are openly hostile to democracy, espouse violence as a political tool, and so classic fascist would fit within that category. But then there's the kind of other side of it, which Mudde calls the radical right, and that's something that I think we more often see referred to as right-wing populists. So that would be parties and movements that have got very hardline nationalist views, hardline right-wing views, but are more committed, at least on the surface, to liberal democratic institutions, engaging in electoral politics. And the populism bit is that very often their political projects will involve presenting themselves as the true representatives of the people or the nation, who are defined in opposition to two groups. And I think it's important to understand the two ways in which they define themselves as the sort of authentic representatives of the people, which is, on the one hand, there is always a kind of a national enemy, so an outsider or an enemy within. In the UK context, that is almost always to do with immigration and cultural difference. But it's also defined in opposition to a supposed elite who have power, who are exercising it illegitimately. So, I'm sure you are all familiar with the way that, particularly after the Brexit referendum, there was a lot of talk in Westminster politics and in the English press that supported Brexit about enemies of the people, North London liberal elites. That's the kind of thing that I mean by that. The second thing to say about this group, the True Believers, far-right activists, is that everything that they're doing in the UK at the moment, so everything that Nigel Farage is doing with Reform UK, or that Tommy Robinson is doing with his attempts to build a far-right street movement, is a local reverberation of something that is happening internationally. And I think understanding it internationally, although that's the least useful in a way for responding to what's going on right in front of our faces, is actually really, really important. Because if you look at the global far-right wave that has appeared in politics in many countries around the world, and crucially outside the West as well as in the West, I think you can understand what actually fundamentally drives it. And for me, what's really important about thinking about it on that level is that in the UK and Ireland, for instance, I think when we talk about the far right, we are almost always immediately also talking about anti-immigration politics. And clearly that is a central element of far right politics here. But actually that's not the case for far right movements everywhere in the world. If you think of India, for example, where you've got the Hindu nationalist government of Narendra Modi, its main kind of national enemy is not directly linked to immigration. It's all about defining the Indian nation along ethno-religious lines and casting Indian Muslims, citizens of India, as outsiders. If you think about the Bolsonaro government in Brazil, that, Bolsonaro now enjoying a spell in prison, I think, but when he was leading Brazil, his movement, again, I think had, as far as I know, very little to say about immigration, but was very strongly anti-leftist, and that's the kind of far right's conception of the left as pretty much anybody who disagrees with them or believes in strong democratic institutions or opposes their corruption. And I think there was a heavy dose there, and perhaps also with Milei in Argentina, of a kind of macho gender politics, again very linked to the idea of the nation, that somehow national pride and strength would be restored by restoring traditional male roles and male dominance in society and so on. And so it's useful to think about it on that international level, because that tells you, okay, well, so what's being mobilised fundamentally is not actually about immigration. Obviously it becomes about that very often, but what kind of lies beneath that is just as important. And there's a writer whose work on this I found very useful recently, called Richard Seymour, who is the author of a recent book called Disaster Nationalism, where he's tried to sort of theorise this and characterise the new far-right wave, sort of to show how it resembles and is different from previous eras of far-right politics globally, sort of the original fascist era, or what happened later in the 20th century in various bits of the world. And I think he's got a very good insight into what's happening now, which is that if you think about it, first of all, on the level of emotions, which I think is very often where politics begins, the kind of key emotion that is being mobilised today are forms of resentment. And Richard's argument is that, these are resentments that are partly sort of the long-term accumulation of failures, frustrations, and so on, that have kind of built up over several decades of an economic system that casts people as sort of, you're either a winner or a loser, you're in competition with your neighbour, you should be getting one over on your rivals, and if you're not, then you're either a loser or, crucially, somebody else is getting an unfair advantage. You can see the sort of economic expression of that resentment, Richard points out, in the actual sort of the positive programmes that a lot of today's far-right movements propose for government, so not what they're against but what they're for bits, which Richard characterises as what he calls muscular national capitalism. So this idea that by voting for far-right populists like Donald Trump or Javier Milei or Nigel Farage or any of their cousins around the world, you're going to deliver this kind of adrenaline shot to the national economy. So, you know, if you think about Doge, Elon Musk's short-lived initiative in the US earlier this year, that was all about kind of unleashing this economic energy by slashing away at federal government spending. This is the kind of thing Farage and other people in Reform UK like to talk about as well. And on the face of it, that doesn't sound that different to traditional Tory economics. You know, so Milei in Argentina, for instance, I think he goes on and on about how much he loves Margaret Thatcher. And it's true that it's employing some of the same economic techniques, but I think what is crucially different about it and what links it back to this politics of resentment is that it's not really the economic policies that are giving this political wave its appeal and its emotional charge. It's the fact that all of this is combined with the promise that we will make you feel better by punishing someone else on your behalf. And that's where it links back to this politics of resentment. So, you know, India's aspirant Hindu middle classes will feel richer and better about themselves if the boot is on the neck of Muslims in India. Or, well, in America, frankly, it's become such a basket case politically that it's hard to know who Trump targets, but the target kind of changes from day to day. But there's always this enemy that has got to be ground down on behalf of, you know, him or his movement. And, you know, it's this punishment of this very often hallucinated enemy. If you think about the kind of wild hallucinations that have come from the far right about trans people, for instance, I think the most vivid expression of which comes from the Russian far-right nationalist philosopher Alexander Dugin, who has got a whole theory about how Ukrainians are what he calls national transgenders. You know, that this is why Russia is at war with Ukraine, because Ukrainians are neither properly Western nor properly Russian, they're sort of in between, and we can't have that. You know, and I mention that example to stress how the target is almost interchangeable, but B, how the resentments kind of build up this sense of what I think, if you're not bought into the ideas, is just kind of almost absurd levels of threat. And I think, you know, you have to understand that anything remotely sensible, however much you might disagree with it, that far-right movements will say, for instance, on the economy, it's only working for them because it's tied into all of this kind of emotional soup beneath. And that brings us actually back to the UK and the UK's own version of these true believers, where there's a version of the last 15 years that, you know, Nigel Farage might cleave to, which is that, well, okay, you say that far-right ideas have gone mainstream, but what's actually happened is we've seen reasonable, legitimate demands from the public about restricting immigration and so on, move from being confined to the mainstreams where they're bolstering extremists like the BNP and treated seriously and made more moderate, and are now being articulated by sensible, reasonable, mainstream democratic politicians like myself, Nigel Farage. And Farage, you know, he will often say this, and I think said it only this week when his former schoolmates were coming out with stories about him being anti-Semitic. He'll say, I'm not far right. I've done more than anyone else in the UK to keep the far right out. Think about all of those years that I campaigned against the BNP. And I suppose that argument, if you were to follow its logic, would be that, well, you know, the members of the public are perfectly entitled to express views on immigration, to express a desire to see it reduced or limited. And it's a part of democratic politics to have parties that represent that position and argue for it, and that's precisely what's happening in the UK with Reform UK. There's no suggestion that Reform UK or any of its prominent politicians engage in violent means. You know, they are, as they would say, they're completely committed to Britain's system of representative democracy. And it's true if you look at it very narrowly like that they are. But I think that the telling gap in that argument is that far-right violence has not gone away in the last 15 years. In fact, it's got worse. And I think that's something that you can see in every country where this kind of new far-right wave has become prominent, taken power, come close to challenging power, is that actually it's had this kind of 1-2 relationship between whatever the kind of vehicle for mainstream respectable politics is and the extremist far-right fringes. So in some countries there's a more direct relationship between these things where leading politicians will have direct links to violent far-right movements. I think India is the most prominent example where there is a wing of the Hindu nationalist movement called the RSS, which is effectively the paramilitary wing of Narendra Modi's party. And Modi and other Hindu nationalist politicians have got a record of saying things that stir up violence or make violence worse when it erupts. Donald Trump is another example, and that's, I think, why he's currently trying to sue the BBC, not because the BBC made an editorial mistake in that film about him, but because that film was about the fact that, as we could all see on January the 6th, 2021, he encouraged his supporters to attempt a coup in Washington to prevent the new democratically elected president taking office. In the UK, it's a bit different, I think. You know, what you've had in the UK, and particularly England, in the last decade or so, is the growth of a right-wing populist electoral movement. So first of all, UKIP, then the Brexit Party, then Reform UK, which are all vehicles for Nigel Farage's project. And then you have had the return of far-right street rallies and violence, for whom the figurehead most of the time is Tommy Robinson. And there is no direct relationship between those two bits in the sense of, like, they're not part of the same movement. Tommy Robinson and Nigel Farage, I imagine, do not speak, do not coordinate what they do. But it's a setup that actually benefits each side very well. So Robinson can spread outright lies about immigrants, Muslims, anybody else he chooses to on the internet. He can spread those lies at particularly sensitive moments, like immediately after the Southport murders in 2024, thereby sparking a wave of racist violence in England, Northern Ireland and elsewhere. He can also bring, as we saw earlier this autumn, tens of thousands of his supporters out onto the street for a rally where speakers pump out racist myths and propaganda and conspiracy theories and the rest of it, the kind of things that even now are not regarded as acceptable discourse within Westminster politics and the London-based political media. And at the same time, Farage doesn't really have to do anything. He just has to say, I'm not associated with all of that, but, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, don't you think they have a point? So his role, for instance, after the Southport murders was where actually he's usually quite skillful at keeping a distance from the extremes of the far right, but I think he slightly tripped up there because in a day or two after the murders, he published his own video to social media where he said, why aren't the police telling us, the full truth about what happened, knowing full well that at the time it was police procedure not to release details of suspects until a certain point in the process. And actually, when the riots really kicked off, he had to then backtrack a bit and sort of edge away from what he had been saying. But that's the dynamic, certainly in English politics, but I suspect there are kind of similarities with what happens in Northern Ireland. Again, similarities with the Republic of Ireland, where you've got the kind of, this attempt to mobilise resentment and to kind of create this presence for it on the streets and in daily life that people then try and pick up and co-opt into a more formal political project. But another question is, well, okay, the far right have been trying to do this for decades, so why are they more successful at doing it now than before? That brings me on to my second group of people that I think are responsible, who I'm going to call opportunists. And by that, I primarily mean the Conservative Party, or rather the Conservative and Unionist Party, as they are not often called these days. And I think the Tories made two key decisions that opened the door to the far right since 2010. One was their decision to push an extreme form of austerity economics after the financial crash from 2010 onwards, which has severely damaged, I think, the social and community fabric of the UK. In England, at least, and I expect there's kind of similar effects here, austerity is responsible for life expectancy stalling and in some cases going backwards for the first time since the start of the 20th century. And I think people mischaracterize austerity a bit sometimes because the sort of headline things that we all notice with the kind of big, really important immediate public services are kind of the more obvious. So kind of a crumbling NHS, for instance, and not being able to get a GP appointment in England, you know, has been really up there with the forefront of political debate. But actually, I think for our purposes here today, it's the less obviously noticeable things that austerity attacked that have really kind of put community life in lots of different parts of the UK under strain. You know, so a good example health-wise is like, don't think of the NHS, but think of drug and alcohol support services, which certainly in England have been completely decimated since 2010. Well, that has knock-on effects for, you know, greater cost to the health service later on, but it also changes the feel and the daily fabric of an area. If you're living in a community where people aren't getting proper support for health issues, then those health issues become very visible on the streets. People start to feel like, oh, well, this area has gone from being safe to being unsafe, you know. And I think that's just happened in so many different areas of life in Britain since 2010. And then the other key thing they did was in the way they handled the Brexit referendum and its aftermath, by which you know, the debate over whether Britain should or shouldn't be a member of a supranational economic bloc is a separate thing, but the Leave campaign was fought on right-wing populist grounds. It was heavily about immigration, and the Tories afterwards doubled down on that. So first of all, Theresa May trying to kind of do a sort of moderate version of it with her citizens of nowhere rhetoric. The Tory press actually going much further, even right from the start, and leaning into this kind of enemies of the people, the liberal elite are blocking the true Brexit and so on discourse. But then in 2019, you had Boris Johnson sort of try to co-opt this growing far-right populism that had emerged around the pro-Brexit camp and bring it into sort of mainstream conservative politics. And when I say opportunists, Johnson's the one that I'm thinking of most of all. You know, so famously, when it was time for him to declare which side he was supporting in the referendum campaign in early 2016, he wrote out two columns, a pro-Leave and a pro-Remain column, had them both on his desk and didn't decide which one to file to the Daily Telegraph until the last minute. I think the idea in 2019, you know, I think Johnson, you know, his project he once described as Brexity Hezza. So Hezza is a reference to Michael Heseltine, who was seen more on a kind of liberal, slightly socially conscious wing of Thatcher's Conservatives in the 80s. You know, he was the politician who, after the riots in Toxteth in Liverpool, argued for more investment in deindustrialised urban areas and so on. And the way Boris Johnson presented his project initially was that it was going to do that. It was going to kind of bring both sides of a divided nation together, or at least a divided England. You know, there'd be a bit more social spending and there'd be a bit more immigration control and there'd be a bit more bashing the liberal elites in London. Everybody happy, the end. That's not what happened. You all, I'm sure, know. What actually happened was he managed to collapse the Tory party, destroy its electoral base, and leave what remains of the Conservatives with a choice about, well, do we try and reconstruct our historically very strong centre-right electoral base, based mainly in the English home counties, or do we keep on chasing the far-right vote? And they have decisively opted for the latter. You know, I mean, it's a disaster for them. They're now on the point of being eclipsed by reform, but I think you can't understate the damage that did to the kind of national political discourse in the UK, and to what kinds of ideas and behaviours it gave legitimacy to as well. And I think their handling of immigration, and within that asylum, is where that's very, very apparent. You know, the Boris Johnson government did two things at once. It was the purveyor of some of the most extreme anti-immigration rhetoric from a UK national government for decades. And it also presided over some of the highest levels of immigration to the UK, which were partly to do with everything going haywire after Brexit and becoming unpredictable, and then after the pandemic, but also because they knew that unless you're willing to make profound structural changes to the British economy, Britain needs that level of immigration, and if it wasn't going to get it from the EU, it was going to get it from people on visas from, say, India or Nigeria. And at the same time, its response to particular immigration issues that upset certain sections of British society and that the far right were agitating over was to just endorse their rhetoric, and sometimes actually come out with more extreme versions of it. And, you know, around the small boats issue, I think the most extreme rhetoric that I came across was not from Nigel Farage or Tommy Robinson, but was from Suella Braverman, who, when she was Home Secretary, you know, explicitly describing it as an invasion, to the extent that, you know, she at least once was challenged by a Holocaust survivor on her rhetoric at a public talk. And I think we're pretty familiar with the effects of the 5 years of the Johnson, Truss and Sunak government now. So I won't say too much more about that, but that does bring me on to my third and final group of people that I think are responsible for the situation we're in, who I am going to call cowards. And that would primarily be the current Labour government. So in July last year, Labour clearly inherited this kind of scorched earth political landscape and very toxic sort of media discourse around immigration and other issues with the UK, and, you know, profound problems with the British state, where it's, I think, and is becoming apparent if you look at today, this week, David Lammy proposing that jury trials in England and Wales are almost entirely abolished, basically because they can't afford to run them anymore. The British state has become unable to carry out some of its basic functions properly. And at the same time, Labour's challenge was to, you know, come up with a solution for that at the same time as dealing with the growth of far-right rhetoric and discourse and ideas that were kind of crowding out everything else from the national UK political conversation. And not only, I think, have they failed to do that, but they've actually actively made things worse in some ways. And I think that comes down to what I would say now, in hindsight, are catastrophic miscalculations they made on entering government. The first one was not seeing that you needed a clear rhetorical and moral challenge to racism in the UK. So if you think about the riots last year after the Southport murders, Starmer was very strong, as you would expect, being a former director of public prosecutions, in putting forward a law and order response that kind of stopped people attacking asylum hotels, you know, which was get the police involved, expedite the court processes, make sure that when people were convicted that they, you know, it was prominently advertised that people were going to prison for quite long spells as a result of the violence. But on the rhetorical level said almost nothing other than I will not tolerate law breaking. You know, that was the moment, I think, that some political leadership could have set a very different tone for the year that followed. And at each moment when it's been necessary for them to challenge racism and anti-immigration politics in that way, they've just been absent. I mean, there's been very mild sort of attempts to correct for that recently. But, you know, again, in January this year, when Elon Musk kicked up a moral panic again about so-called grooming gangs, and that just fed straight into British political discourse, Labour panicked and sort of said, okay, what do you want us to do about it? And again, this summer with England's flag protests, there was Stammer, I think it was on holiday, it didn't even seem to be treated as a sort of emergency for the British government. The second miscalculation, I think, links back to this idea that, of what austerity has done to the UK and not seeing the UK in need of some quite urgent and profound repairing. I think, their pitch for government was based on the idea that as long as you had nicer, more honourable and more competent people in charge, you could kind of just, things would right themselves. And I think that, A, that wasn't true, B, there is also a question over whether they are actually competent. And I think what's happened is that instead of being able to push back effectively at the growth of far-right politics, Labour have formulated a response that is mainly driven by fear. I think all of their various policy pronouncements on immigration and asylum this year are driven by fear of a section of their own voters. And by a belief, which is a sort of hand-me-down version of kind of New Labour and Tony Blair's triangulation strategy, that if you just meet your opponents halfway, meet your critics halfway, and give them a bit of what they want, that will kind of solve the problem, it will kind of quell the unrest and so on. And I think that's not what's happening. They have totally endorsed the idea that refugees seeking sanctuary in the UK, as refugees will continue to do, and not at higher levels than they do in other countries in Europe, for instance. They've completely endorsed the myth that Britain is experiencing an unusually high, disproportionate number of people seeking asylum, and that they are inherently taking Britain for a ride and the cause of social problems. And they've also endorsed the far right's arguments that immigration destroys national and cultural identity, and that you need to somehow punish immigrants for their presence in the UK, which ironically, if you look at the kind of policies that Shabana Mahmood has been proposing recently, are almost guaranteed to make integration harder. So leaving people on precarious and temporary forms of immigration status for up to 20 years is precisely the opposite of what's required to create healthy, strong, thriving communities. So that's the three groups that I wanted to tell you about. I'll just end with a couple of thoughts on where I think that leaves us now. It obviously is a worrying time, but I would say despite all of that, and this is something, I suppose I've been thinking about this obviously in the English context most of all, but thinking about the flag protest this summer. They're alarming, they're everywhere, people are very worried by them, they are symbols of intimidation, and they have encouraged people to go out and physically intimidate, not just people from migrant backgrounds, but people who challenge the politics on which they're based. So in a neighbourhood not far from mine in London, there's a cafe, cafe and music venue whose owner went out and asked people putting flags up on High Street why they were doing it and challenged them. She was threatened by them. So as a response, encouraged all the cafe's customers to bring in flags from all around the world. And they said, well, if you like flags so much, let's have more of them and let's put as many flags as we like. What the fascists who'd been putting the flags up then did was smash all the windows of that cafe at night. Cafe pushed back, brought in tens of thousands of pounds of donations, has been restored, is still there, is still challenging it. And I think that story, and there's there's hundreds of these stories from all around the UK, tell me that actually the far right, despite its noisiness and bullying nature, is actually not as strong as it seems. That actually this is fundamentally about a minority who are trying to bully the rest of us into silence and intimidate us into silence. And that strongly challenging that is the first step towards getting rid of them politically. But that's only the first step. And I think that's kind of what certainly Westminster politics is missing at the moment, is that pushing back against the far right, drawing a clear line between what is acceptable and what isn't, is a way to win space to then propose a political alternative that can actually create strong and diverse and thriving communities. That's, I think, been sorely missing from the various groups of politicians I've talked about today. And I think the only way we're going to reach that is by people getting engaged and pushing for it. All summer, actually, as I was watching these flags go up, you know, in neighbourhoods quite near mine, in South London, in other bits of the country, if you drive along motorways in the south of England at the moment, you'll see them hanging from gantries overlooking the motorway. I was thinking about Northern Ireland and thinking, well, actually, I bet people here have got a lot of thoughts on how this works, how to deal with it, and so on. But it also put me in mind of a quote from a 20th century thinker and campaigner who knew a lot about national identity, its importance, and also its danger. And I had this quote ringing around my head all summer, so I thought I'd read it out to you. And it's the observation that hardline nationalists, you know, of all stripes, what they really exhibit, despite all the noise and the kind of chest puffing, is actually a lack of self-confidence and a lack of confidence in the communities that they're supposed to represent. And this thinker said this was evident in their, quote, rejection of tolerance and the need for domination. It's visible in the abandonment of peaceful processes. It is proclaimed in attitudes that seek victory and not accommodation. It is trumpeted by those whose eyes mist over with self-righteous emotion as they wave national flags, their cherished possession. They don't seem to notice that the real level of their respect is measured by their painting the flag on curbstones for everyone to trample on. And that last line, I think, for me, you just need to update it a little bit for England and say, well, they're not painting them on curbstones. They're tying them up high and inexpertly on lampposts in a way that suggests they're not confident because they're putting up them up so high because they know that people will just come and take them down again. Anyway, that thinker was John Hume, writing in 1989. Maybe you all know this quote, but it was new to me when I came across it a year or two ago, and I think it's quite useful. So I will end on that. Thank you.